Nick, if I can ask you to come up. Really pleased to have the Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire here, Nick Dean. Nick, over to you. I won't introduce your delegates.
Okay.
I'll leave that to you, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Alex, and hopefully they're here. They are. Good. What a relief. Okay, first of all, welcome to Cambridge. As Alex has described, I'm the Chief Constable of Cambridge, and just to give you a warning that as you walked in the law faculty this morning, your faces were loaded onto facial recognition. They're on my watch list, so please behave this evening. It's a huge privilege to be here, one as a graduate of the course back in 2015, but as the local chief, it's also a great privilege to facilitate this afternoon's session. This afternoon's session outlines 3 approaches to tackling violence against women and girls. In December 2021, the National Police Chiefs Council, in association with the College of Policing, launched a national framework in relation to VAWG. The aim was to improve, coordinate and standardise policing of this vital agenda. 3 pillars of activity were outlined, as I'm sure most of you will know: building trust and confidence, relentless pursuit of perpetrators and safer spaces. And much has been done to deliver this framework. And in 2023, it was heightened by the Home Secretary announcing that VAWG was to be a national threat and included it in the strategic policing requirement. So this afternoon we'll hear about 3 approaches, as I've said, to tackling the VAWG agenda. First of all, a study into public crime space in Sutton, disrupting predatory behaviour in the nighttime economy, and the 3rd presentation is tackling, testing and targeting, Larry will be proud of me, in terms of sexual risk orders. So my first speaker is Abu. So while Abu comes down, Abu will be presenting his findings into that first topic. Abu is a Prevent Strategy Manager from London Borough of Brent. He's a barrister, he's an experienced community safety professional. His 17 years of experience in victim and witness services and community safety have been marked by his leadership in significant projects and multi-agency collaborations. Abu, your strategic vision, leadership skills, refined at victim support in the London Borough of Sutton, have enhanced public safety and fostered strong multi-agency partnerships. Abu's got an academic background, it's as diverse as his professional experience, and he's a visiting lecturer at Cambridge City Centre for Evidence-Based Policing. So Abu, over to yourself and welcome to Cambridge.
Thank you. That's a very big introduction to follow. So hopefully I'm able to cover what I need to. So as you've heard, I work in a local authority, not necessarily policing background, but very close to our police colleagues. With a number of high-profile murders in public places, which reminded us how significant the harm can be, brought the kind of issue to the forefront of discussion. And in a borough like Sutton, which is a small London local authority in the south of London, I started actually looking at, before we start devising the response, we really need to define it properly. So this is my attempt to define the problem so we can develop a targeted response. First of all, I looked at, can I map the violence against women and girls in public places and understand their concentration in different places. The other area that I wanted to look at is what are their temporal pattern? How do they look in seasonality, in time of the day, day of the week? And finally, do they differ between different ethnic and age groups? So the data I used was actually longitudinal data from the police recorded crime. They provided me with the relevant kind of geolocation information, which wasn't possible to actually supplement with other sources because other sources didn't necessarily kind of match. It's very difficult to do that. The harm that I referred to was calculated based on Cambridge Crime Harm Index. I have used the geolocation information kind of system analysis along with a longitudinal machine learning module called KML to understand their trend over the 10-year period. And I've also used a risk-adjusted disparity index to understand the difference of impact of fog between different age groups and ethnic groups. I wouldn't have a great deal of time talking about the various challenges in data, but just summarizing the outcomes or the findings here. First of all, this is a replication study where I have copied from a predecessor in my course and another MST student here from 2022. I believe Craig is here today. He was really helpful in actually understanding some of the work he has done so I could build on it. What we found, or what 2022 study found, is that the violence against women and girls incident and harm both concentrated in a small amount of places, small proportion of places. So the London Borough of Sutton was divided into 1 hectare size hexagons. There were 4,500 of them. And what I found in my study that only 3% or about 3% of the places contained 50% of the harm, leaving about more than 60% of the places free from any violence against women and girls incident in public places. I also found that the harm concentration is higher, so only 2% of those places concentrated had 50% of the harm. This is slightly different than the previous study in terms of the concentration, where it was actually found 0.48% of the places contained 50% of the harm in South BCU London. The difference, there are different explanations in terms of understanding what might have caused the difference. There are high concentration of crime or high volume crime in boroughs like Croydon, which was covered in the previous studies, but I also looked at a longitudinal kind of 10-year period where I had over 8,000 crime record to analyze. What my interest was is that it's easy to highlight the concentration of crime in hotspots and harm spots in a cumulative data, but what we're really interested in is to understand, do those hotspots remain hot over the period of 10 years? Do those harm spots remain high over this 10-year period? So what I have used is a trajectory analysis using the KML package, which is an unsupervised machine learning module. The crust of it is that it ran the model many times to identify the most homogeneous group. On the left-hand side, you have the trends that the AI model was able to identify 4 clusters. One in blue, which is the high acute hotspots, only 2 hexagons that remained very hot over this whole 10-year period. And then that is followed by acute hotspots of 25 hexagons. But that leaves about 1,500 hexagons with very few violence against women and girls incidents. So this analysis excluded the crime-free areas. On the left-hand side, you have the harm spot kind of analysis over this 10-year period, the same 10-year starting from 2023 to 2022, 2013 to 2022. What you have there is that the machine learning was able to identify, it is difficult to segregate the data because harm spot can jump and come down at various times. However, it was able to identify 90 harm spots which remained high in average. You can see that in red line on top, that was harmful all the way through over this 10-year period. What our interest is that Sutton is one of the safest boroughs in London. The crime numbers and the harm remain relatively low. And resources, accordingly, are low. So we need to concentrate our efforts to even smaller areas. So what I'm really trying to show there is that our interest is to identify persistent hotspots of high harm. That's the intersection highlighted in red in Venn diagram. My 8-year-old son was telling me what kind of diagram it is. And so it's quite helpful for me to go back. But it actually shows, in a theoretical kind of sense, that is a very small number of places we are talking about from the 4,500 kind of hexagons we started with. And that is the 19 hotspots of high harm, which are persistently high over this 10-year period, and they urgently requires interventions. What you have here is the map, and the shading are done on the basis of the values of the indices of multiple deprivation data that shows the shading of those areas, and the red are the marked harm spots of hotspots of high harm. What we see that most of the hotspots of high harm appear in deprived areas. However, there are anomalies. But there is one commonality between all of them. These are intersections and high streets and bus stops close to our girls' schools. So one of the things that I found is that a routine activity theory explanation fits the best here. It is the suitable victims, motivated offender coming into a place which lacks the capable guardianship that is causing it, not necessarily the deprivation itself. I just wanted to highlight that the explanations are quite useful to understand, and that helps us to devise the response accordingly. Now, when we look at the data in terms of the temporal analysis, what you have here, starting from the left-hand side, Monday, 12 o'clock, going the whole week, ending on midnight on Sunday. It's very interesting and possibly quite understandable to see that the harm spiked in midnight repeatedly every single day of the week. What was unexpected was actually the hot kind of crime incident spike between 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the blue line spiking more than the red line, and that's been highlighted with those blue kind of bars. So that's only during the weekdays, not during the weekends. And that is more explained in the next slide when we look at the age distribution. This shows the per thousand population harm by various age groups. What we do see that by the time a girl becomes 12, their number of incidents against that age group starts growing until 16, and then gradually reducing when it goes to about 22 or so. But that doesn't hold true when we distribute it by per thousand population, because 15 to 19 ends up being the highest harm suffering group. And that remains relatively high throughout this 10-year period, which is followed closely by 10 to 15-year-olds. And what we see is that there is a big lump of age, 30 and over, which stays right at the bottom all the way through in this 10-year period. So it is actually the secondary school kids, the college children, young women, and potentially the early university students who are experiencing the highest level of harm from violence against women and girls in public places in Sutton. Now, this is the data on ethnicity. I will actually use a level of caution because there were lots of missing data. But from the data that we had, I had to lump kind of multiple groups into the broader Black, Asian, and white ethnic groups for comparison purposes. What we see here, that when the study started, the harm a Black female experienced were more than double than the harm the Asian females experienced. But by the time we end our research, that is many more time. It fluctuated over the period. And one of the interesting thing to look at is that the population changed over this period of time. So that has been reflected. Even though the borough became more diverse, the minoritized community from 20% became 40% of the population, the disparity got worse. So it's a food for thought in understanding how do we devise our responses to combat this challenge. The other thing that I looked at, there were many maps that I produced, but these are the two that I'm only highlighting to show that the harm spots and hot spots for children and adults are not exactly the same. The harm spots and hot spots for a white woman is not the same as the black woman. So these are different places. Where there are intersections between those, there are also segregations between those hotspots. So we need to devise a response that takes that into account. And now is the Dennis question, which is, so what? So first of all, the point that I want to make is that this is a study that validates the previous finding that it is in a small number of places violence against women and girls are concentrating. We need a placed focused response, especially the Home Office funding that is being awarded for various public space Vogue responses. It needs to be data-driven and understanding where exactly are the highest problems so that it can be driven in small number of places to make the maximum impact. Secondly, children are being affected the most. Our safeguarding professionals, the partnership, the education has a huge role. It is not just the police job to protect our young people. And we need to be able to work in partnership. Possibly I've got a bias because I work in partnership services, but I see the value of working together to combat the issues. And finally, we're only scratching the surface around the racial disparity. We really need to look deeper. What is causing all of this racial kind of significantly high level of harm, and how do we combat it? I don't have one answer, but as a starting point, we need to segregate those harmful spots that are affecting our minority communities and then target those as well, rather than going on kind of a blanket, all fits in one category. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Abby. So don't go away. We might have to answer some difficult questions. Thanks very much. So our second presentation is by Tina Wallace, Thames Valley Police. Tina is presenting her work on disrupting predatory behaviour in the nighttime economy. While Tina comes down, Tina is a detective inspector working as a covert operations manager and is a tactical lead for Operation Vigilant. Tina has spent 25 years in covert policing, many accolades to her work, so much so that she was awarded the King's Policing Medal in 2022. Her experiences both in counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime has given her a broad base of the application of proactive methodologies to combat serious crime. So this afternoon, Tina will showcase the content of Project Vigilant and how the same concept can be applied across different crime types, but are clearly specifically within the Vogue space. So Tina, over to yourself. Welcome.
Thank you, Wallace. So violence against women and girls is now being spoken about in the same context of that of counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime. So what can we learn from those areas of policing, and how can we leverage those methods and tactics, and more importantly, the approach to the crime, and use it in the Vogue space? And that's what Project Vigilant is aiming to do. So our main point on this is, within counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime, we don't wait for offences to happen. So counter-terrorism police are always relentlessly pursuing terrorists in order to prevent them from committing a terrorist attack. And it's the same for serious and organised crime. We don't wait for drugs to be imported, then distributed, and then robustly investigate. We're looking to stop it. So how can we stop those sexual offences, which is what we're looking at in Project Vigilant, and use those same methods? So we know that research, we've got all the statistics on serious violence, sexual violence specifically, the Vogue arena, but we're looking at stranger sexual offending in public spaces. It's not necessarily the nighttime economy. The nighttime economy is just simply a hunting ground for offenders, just like any other spaces. But my research was focused on the nighttime economy, and that's the stage and that was set. But what we do know about some of the statistics is that I think it's around about 64% of adult females are exposed to harassment, sexual harassment on a daily basis. That number could slightly be higher now, but it's 64% of women. But the biggest takeaway from this is 2/3 of stranger rapes start with an interaction between an offender, the rapist, and his victim. And it's within that interaction whereby he's assessing her vulnerability, and he does that by a number of means. And some of those behaviours that he uses at that point are akin with street harassment. These are opportunities to disrupt that offender, to be able to spot those predatory behaviours, that interaction that he's having with the victim whilst he's assessing her vulnerability, and be able to stop it. So the idea is, well, there is some context behind this, but the idea is to use behavioural detection in order to identify specific behaviours. So the context and the background for this started with a covert operation. Of course it was, because I'm covert operations manager, back in 2019, whereby we had a rise in serious sexual offending linked to the nighttime economy and a spike in stranger rapes. But more worryingly, we had an individual who we believed he was targeting victims as they were walking home from a night out. He was stalking them home, following them, waiting until they were going to sleep. And then he broke into their houses. Initially, he started to steal from them, watching them sleep, and then his behaviour escalated. So we mounted a covert operation in order to draw him out and then follow him, identify him and then follow him, in order to be able to prevent him from committing any more offences. And whilst we did that, we did draw him out, and then we identified him through specific behaviours, which I will go into. But more worryingly, we identified a number of individuals demonstrating exactly the same behaviours as him. And there were 41 that we stopped in a period of 6 weeks. And we took the decision early on to stop every single individual, because surveillance is normally evidence gathering. We very, very rarely intervene, but we did with uniform intervention, and we stopped 41 individuals, and they fell into 4 distinct categories. Those categories were men who were convicted sex offenders, child abusers, adult rapists, but convicted sex offenders. We stopped a number of men who had been arrested previously for sexual offending, but never been charged or convicted. We stopped men who had a criminal record for other crime types, which is also relevant, and it becomes relevant. And then we stopped men who had never come to our attention ever before. So we did wonder, was this a massive coincidence, or was there something in this? And then we approached the Serious Crime Analysis section, who assigned us a behavioural investigative advisor who's been working with us ever since, providing guidance, advice, steering us in the right direction, and actually helping us with some risk assessment and threat management. And we had some enormous success within that 6 weeks. Our chief wanted us to broaden this strategy to cover the entire Thames Valley for our main nighttime economies, of which we have 4. But this is not a surveillance operation. This is actually good old-fashioned proactive policing, and the tactics that we use for drug dealing, crime, other crime types like car crime, robberies, that proactive work, which we just applied to the nighttime economy. And then we did this. So we embedded this across our 4 main nighttime economies, and all of them are very different, but they share common factors. So each has got a university campus, each have busy weekends, public events, payday weekends. But they all are quite different as well, but they've all got transport hubs, so it's easy to get in and out of those nighttime economies. So we wanted to show as well that the common factors, but the distinctions within that. At the same time, we'd been running this for about a year, having a lot of success in our view. But what we also did as well is, because we had to train officers to do this, because surveillance officers, we're professional observers. I look at people for a living, and I watch people, I follow people. I can't believe I get paid for it, in all honesty. But we have learned what to look for, and you can tell generally from a criminal's perspective when someone's in their precursor stages about to commit a criminal offence, and then the aftermath. How do we teach that to officers? Because even as a surveillance officer, I've never been taught criminal behavioural detection. That's come through experience. So we had to then share that experience with 200 officers across Thames Valley Police. And then we decided to do some research on it. So then I had to look at previous studies that had been done, which had not been done in this area, in all honesty, and then apply some theory knitting effectively. So this is actually the really fascinating bit. So I mentioned the 4 categories of the individual that we stopped. So I was looking at any sort of research studies on the motivations of convicted sex offenders, plus geographical profiling. So this is like the motivations on the sex offenders. So Lissac and Miller. And the interesting one is that most men are prosecuted on a single count of rape or sexual assault. Yet, according to them, through their interviews with the researchers, They're likely to have committed anywhere between 7 and 11 rapes before they got caught, which is quite significant and really scary. And then there's another study, and it's called the undetected rapist. So for this is the individual, for me, the one that gets arrested but never gets charged because we don't have enough to convict them or charge them. And then these individuals could be roaming our streets, and every time they offend, because they're likely to have very lengthy offending careers, every time they offend, they're building their criminal pedigree, which is no different to other criminals. So you never just become the head of an organised crime group. You don't just become an armed robber. You start somewhere, and that is no different to what is a proficient rapist. So I was concerned with the motivations of these individuals, but I also wanted to look at the geographical profiling, because that's the bit. I'm an armchair profiler. I watch people and I love watching their behaviours. So this is interesting. It's about the typologies of how these men commit crime. So it's, I suppose the academic term is the journey to crime. But the interesting one is like the hunter-poacher. So a hunter is someone who operates in their home area, and the poacher travels outside of his home area to offend. Then we've got the troller, who's an opportunistic offender. The troller's probably fantasised about this, but if you take this to modern crime trends and the fact that most of the men we stop are in their 20s, they've grown up in a digital world. They've got access to the dark web and the metaverse, which is where they're no longer just fantasising about it. They're learning, they're developing their criminal pedigree with the use of haptic suits. So they've actually done this in the metaverse, and then when they go out into the nighttime economy or public spaces, they've already done this before, so it's no longer a fantasy. And then the trapper's quite interesting. So Rossmo's work, 1 to 2% of, it was just less than 2% of the individuals they spoke to were trappers. These are people who've got a position in life that brings them into contact with victims. In the nighttime economy, taxi drivers, door staff, our data set was at least 5%. If we run that now, it's up to nearly the double figures, because we're seeing more and more fake taxi drivers. So if you just Google rape, fake taxi drivers, you'll just get a stream. So that's quite significant, and I think we need to look at that. So the sexual violence continuum and the street harassment. So I think street harassment is often seen as low level, meaningless, it's benign, and it depends on who's been exposed to it. So someone who was to invade my personal space might get a different response, probably a slap in the face, rather than someone like a young 17-year-old female who's a little bit more nervous. But because rape and sexual assault is so complex, and it's rarely just black and white, and all of the men we stop don't think they're doing anything wrong, you can see how through the sexual violence continuum it exists on structured levels, and you can see how easy this escalates, because in their mind it's normal, it's shaped by their individual beliefs, their social, cultural norms, and then all of a sudden, as you go up the scale, you can absolutely see the street harassment is prevalent in this, and then all of a sudden it becomes a rape and sexual assault. So how does it work for us? It really is simple. We send officers out. You've got a couple of plain clothes. We do not go into bars and venues. That's something very, very different. We do that in the covert space, but we don't do that for this. So you have plainclothes officers who are spotters, spotting predatory behaviour. Uniform intervention will always intervene. And every time we see a behaviour or two behaviours, depending on which ones they are, we will stop and we will disrupt that particular individual, and we do that through a conversation, and it's a robust conversation, which we've had to teach our officers how to do this. So this enhanced training we give our officers, it's criminal behavioural detection, it's about having a conversation, and it's about drawing information out and developing professional curiosity, intelligence gathering, intelligence submission. So that's what we do, and they've all been through this training in both the plainclothes and the uniform context. So we know exactly what everybody's doing. And every stop and account is not a stop and search unless we've got grounds for it, which we don't at the moment, but we're working on that. Thank you, Peter. And then we capture it on body-worn video as well. So we've got that transparency. Here's our behaviours. So this is, we don't just stop in anyone and then just send them out the nighttime economy. We record all of that, and then the magic of Project Vigilant, in my view, is what we do afterwards, is how are we managing the risk they pose and then this threat management, and we do that. So here's the behaviours. So that the top row, loitering without legitimate reason. I mean, it's such a woolly offence, but actually, for the proactive cops in the room, you'll know this, that's the equivalent of a criminal recce. Criminals don't want to be caught. They'll do everything to avoid being caught, and they pre-plan. So that comes out in loitering. And for us in the nighttime economy, we'll see men hanging around near taxi stands in dark doorways. They'll stand in bus stops. I nearly called them a bus request. That's a surveillance speak there. They'll stand in bus stops. They won't even look to where the bus is coming because they're fixated on somebody else, normally a young female or a group of females. So, and then as they get their confidence, they'll unwanted sexual attention, sexualised comments. So those are the behaviours we capture, our officers capture, and they also capture the dynamic risk factors. And these are, because alcohol and drugs is prevalent in the nighttime economy, you'd suspect that this sort of alcohol would drive the behaviour. So we capture that as well as deteriorating mental health, change in personal circumstances. We've just added asylum seekers to that as well, because every time we stop an individual who doesn't who can't remain here, they'll often say, this is okay in my country. So we capture that as well. And those go on our standardised debrief form, and then we then capture the static risk factors. And this is where our intelligence officer delves deep. This is how we use the same sort of methods we do in serious and organised crime. We have a look at what has gone on in their criminal career history. So just because somebody's been labelled as a drug dealer, well, actually, drug dealers, there's generally another crime type: violence, knife crime, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, all sorts. So we're looking at everything, why they've come to our attention previously. And then that information then goes through to our operational lead, which is Sasha, which is here, and she conducts a risk assessment. And we categorise each individual based on that. So it was the serious crime analysis section who helped us devise this. So this risk assessment was devised specifically from our observations from a Project Vigilant Patrol, and that's how we use this. So we've messed around with the bottom, the D, so we've called it D risk, no risk, is there any risk, and we keep playing around with that. But initially, when people came to our attention and we didn't think there were any risk whatsoever, we didn't do anything with it. But when I started my research here, we looked back at the people we'd stopped, and we'd seen at least 14% of the people we classed as no risk had come back into the nighttime economy and done it again. Therefore, we capture that. And every 6 months, we review the Ds or the no risks just to check, and then they can fall off the list. But depending on where they are within that risk assessment would dictate what we do next, because we're always going to do something. It could be an old-fashioned, robust conversation with the individual after the fact. We'll go and visit them the next day and say, you are out of order. It could be education, especially if they are not born here and they've recently come here, so it could be that. That's usually done with our PCSOs or a local sergeant. It then starts to escalate, where we've also got a charity that works with us, Circle South East. We refer people into Circle South East. We've had a massive success with that, 47 referrals in the last 6 months. But we won't refer them in if there's a criminal investigation, because we just don't. And then it goes up the scale. So, of course, we could use sexual risk orders. We're trying everything. We're looking for conventional means. Sasha's been working with immigration enforcement in the last week alone, because we can potentially get some people deported. So there's lots we can do. And, of course, it's in the covert environment. It would be remiss if I didn't use some covert tactics against some of those individuals. The A-pluses are normally convicted sex offenders. They go straight into our Mossavo teams. We don't do anything with them, and we don't apply a second risk matrix to them because there's already one in being. So findings from my research, sorry, no pretty graphs. So street harassment does not correlate with the university term times. We know that. It actually correlates with end of the month, pay weekends, bank holidays, public events, Freshers Week, massive for us. That's where all the predators seem to come out. What else is up there? So, university, it is thriving under our watchful gaze. So I'd looked at the situational crime prevention, routine activities, rational choice. And I think when I first started this programme, I thought routine activities and the absence of a capable guardian meant there was nobody there. Actually, for me, it's the absence of capability. So what are we capable of identifying what we're seeing and connecting that with a serious sexual assault, potentially, or capable of even identifying it and then what to do about it, because this is not just a policing problem, because we can use our partners to support this as well, bystanders, and Tom, who's also my colleague, who's been working with me on this. We're looking at working with guardians, street angels, and I think we're doing a national presentation to a big group of the guardians, because they're key for this as well, because they're also professional observers. So we're looking to for that aspect is improving the capability. Males, so there's a star there, so that's a limitation. So males aged 20 to 27, more likely to be stopped. Well, of course, because the nighttime economy draws younger people in. But serious crime analysis section shows that the prevalent data set for them for serious and sexual violent offenders are in the 20s. So there might be something within that. 40% of perpetrators have a VOG history, and that could be any type of VOG, but we wanted to connect that. But we did show that 75% of individuals we stop have a PNC record. And again, there are some limitations with that, but when you look at the labelling of offenders, just because somebody's known as a drink driver, we've got a couple of drink drivers, but actually they were prowling well before, so there's some predatory tendencies. And that's the crossover offending. There is a cultural component to this as well, so we've done a different study with Buckingham University on this one. But what we've seen is that white males are more prevalent in our data set, but they're overrepresented in the B group, but it's more likely to be black and Asian males who are more prevalent in the A and the A pluses. So we're looking at that as well. The University of Buckingham have done that, but that's another study that we need to draw on. And then the typologies, the hunter-poacher, I obviously shown that there. So 22% of our perpetrators travelled outside of TVP. The majority were local offenders or perpetrators, but are they just starting out on their criminal journey? Because that's the one thing, and I know I wildly speculated about it in my thesis, but because they've got to start somewhere, can we look at that? Can we look at where they're starting their criminal offending within the VOG space? So what about policies and really how this could affect policing? It's about the proactive management of some of these offenders, because many of you work in that space will know that we tend to react, but we've got to be more proactive about it. We've scaled this up. Lots of other forces are doing this, and you can see up there, some forces are just about to come on board with it. It's really working for them, and it's about that proactive training for them. And the last thing really, bringing it straight back to counter-terrorism, serious and organised crime, is that they use intelligence-led policing to prevent it happening. SOC, they're disrupting and dismantling OCGs, organised crime groups, all the time. But someone walks free from custody because we haven't got enough to charge them on. We let them go and we do nothing with it. So that's not a famous quote because I'm not famous, but it is mine. It is mine. We've got to stop missing these opportunities. But thank you for inviting me back, and thank you, Peter, for the championing.
Great, fantastic presentation. So our third and final presentation on this session is from Detective Chief Inspector Dan Whitten from the Metropolitan Police. Dan will present on how sexual risk orders, a nice segue, can be effectively used as a tactic to counter offences of violence against women and girls. Dan will cover how SROs are currently being used against the most harmful offenders and whether their application can lead to harm reduction. So Dan works as an SIO within the Met Police, leading homicide investigations. Prior to this, 10 years in a range of uniform and detective roles. And as I've said, this focuses on recent research of SROs. So, Dan, over to yourself. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to talk about, I think, is a lot more specific and a lot less... has a lot less breadth than the previous two presentations, but I think it's relevant, particularly to yours. I'm not going to labour the point about the relevance. The VOG agenda has been thoroughly well covered. This research topic came to my attention or drew my interest predominantly watching offenders come through custody through my investigation teams, and repeatedly for many, many different reasons, evidential reasons, we released them and we saw them back in again and watched that offending escalate. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that with positive outcome rates, what they are in many crime types, particularly around sexual offending, that we need to ask the question, how do we manage risk when we can't prosecute? So that brought me on to the concept of sexual risk orders. I will run through these very quickly because I know not everyone will know what sexual risk orders are. Essentially, a court needs to be satisfied that there is an act of a sexual nature and that an order is necessary to protect the public. That's the extent of the legal test. It does not require conviction, so they're standalone orders, and the legal bar is incredibly low. The judiciary previously tried to argue that they should apply a criminal threshold to this, i.e. beyond reasonable doubt, and the legislature very quickly made clear that no, we want this to be a burden of proof concept, or a balance of probabilities concept. Hearsay evidence is admissible, but consequently breach of an order is punishable with a criminal sanction of up to 5 years imprisonment. So it's a hybrid order: civil rules of evidence, civil burden of proof, criminal sanction for breach. The duration of those orders is a minimum of 2 years, but they can be indefinite, so they can be applied to someone for life. And as we see, the judiciary generally apply them for much longer than the minimum period. The conditions of these orders, I thought this was a bit interesting, not so much the first 2 points, which say what they say. Positive conditions, we can have positive conditions on these since 2022, so not just you can't, but also you must. But of particular interest, how austere some of the conditions already in place are. So those are 3 examples on pre-existing London-based sexual risk orders, and some of them are incredibly, they're incredibly onus. The onus they place on someone and the derogation of those individual rights is considerable. So then when we look at what the contention is around sexual risk orders, it's quite clear. You've got all justification for these, in whatever guise that is, whether that's the National VOG strategy or anywhere else, is all couched in terms of these prevent future sexual harm and therefore they are justifiable, they're justified. Those that don't agree would argue that you've got a really, really significant derogation of individual rights, which we know we do because we've looked at some of those conditions. You don't require conviction. The established rules of evidence that would usually be required for that level of sanction are disregarded essentially, and you can't demonstrate that these work effectively other than anecdote. And the official data collection around sexual risk orders is really, really, really very limited. The college found when they asked that the vast majority, or a large proportion of forces couldn't explain how many sexual risk orders they actually had in place. And we are not clear on how we use them, who do we target them against, are they associated with harm reduction, and importantly, do we target them on your Cat A or Cat A plus type offenders? So those were the questions that I'll leave that one, that I sought to speak to. How do we currently use sexual risk orders? Is there an association between them and harm reduction, particularly sexual harm reduction, as those that advocate for them would suggest there is? And are they targeted against the most harmful offenders? So just a word on general methodology. 3 samples used within this. One is a national sample from 2015 to 2018. It is skewed inherently towards those offenders that were considered to be of higher harm, and the judiciary implemented sexual risk orders of at least 8 years in duration. There's a Met or a London-centric sample from 2021 to 2023, and it is the best effort to say this is the totality of sexual risk orders that we have in place currently. So it should be a holistic sample of all sexual risk orders granted in London between those 2 years. And there's reference, which I'll make later on, to a counterfactual sample. Again, this is Met data between 2015 and 2018, and these are individuals for whom we discussed with the legal team the concept of acquiring a sexual risk order, but subsequently did not do so. I must stress that this isn't a control, and there are differences between that counterfactual and those other groups. So I explored a number of different ways of trying to identify subjects with sexual risk orders. As I say, we don't have a good data collection regime, certainly nationally, and in a large number of forces around these. Police National Computer was the best option available. It gets loaded directly to the PNC from court. The downside is they drop off after they expire, so they're only a good insight into those sexual risk orders that are still currently in place. Offending, this study uses arrest data, and I'm not going to go into the pros and cons that sit behind that, but that's when I talk about offending, I'm talking about arrest data, again derived from PNC. Sexual, it's either an offence under the Sexual Offences Act or as designated Section 78 of the Sexual Offences Act under that definition of sexual, and when I reference harm, I'm talking about the Cambridge Crime Harm Index. So how do we currently use these? And I'll go for this quite quickly. The first takeaway is that in the last 2 years nationally, 307 is the total of sexual risk orders that we have obtained. And you can see there's wide variation just in raw numbers between forces. Interestingly, if you look at sexual harm prevention order, that's in the many, many thousands. So there's a disparity between the two tactics. If you then look at some of the differences between force areas in terms of the population within them, or RSO prevalence is a very crude assessment of prevalence of sexual offending, you see that there's still vast difference between forces, which perhaps speaks to a lack of coordination nationally about the use and perhaps individual area or individual force preference. And then this just demonstrates that even within one force area, you see, albeit very, very small numbers, but considerable variation based just on command area. So we don't appear to have a uniform or consistent approach to sexual risk orders. Some of the characteristics of recipients, again, I'm not going to labour this. The 2 points that I would make are that around ethnicity, certainly in London, we see sexual risk orders assigned to people consistent with their prevalence in the population. So there's something around the race action plan and being able to explain and rationalise that. And one of the concerns raised is that sexual risk orders can be applied to people as young as 10. This data would suggest that certainly in London that's not what is happening. The youngest person with a sexual risk order is 18. So catalyst for sexual risk orders, and by that I mean in what context do we first seek to use them? Overwhelmingly, we use them when prosecution fails. There's nothing to stop them being used during a prosecution to bolster bail conditions. There's nothing to stop them being used on an intelligence basis only, and again, Tina, I think that comes back to some of your stuff. But overwhelmingly, we only use them when prosecution fails. I think concerningly, in at least 40% of those cases, we wait until prosecution has failed at least 3 times before we move or look at sexual risk orders. I think I'll come on to some of the more specifics, but ultimately I think it's very difficult to look at the data around sexual risk orders and not view them as currently used as an option of last resort. This is a typical example just to try and draw out some of the what sits behind this data, and this is quite typical in the sexual risk order data. This is not some form of anomaly. You'll see repeated offending of really serious nature alleged by multiple different victims, and you'll see multiple failed prosecutions, and often the failure of those prosecutions can probably be explained by virtue of the evidential difficulties in terms of vulnerability of victims. This particular individual gets a sexual risk order January 2018. Bear that in mind going forward. Association between sexual risk orders and harm reduction. So this is on the MPS sample. So before sexual risk order, in the period beforehand, the average sexual harm per month looks like that. And afterwards, we see that an 84.5% less sexual harm caused by those individuals. The national sample with much greater longevity. So this is 10 years before sexual risk order and at least 8 years after sexual risk order. And this is sexual harm per month at liberty, so it takes account of imprisonment. And we see that that's 93.1% less sexual harm afterwards. That is descriptive only. I'll caveat that with that, but I think that's quite a noticeable difference. These are also worth noting not people who are going to prison for a hugely long period of time, are being deported. Those have been accounted for within the data, and that is not what we see here. When you model that over a period of time, longitudinally, that's what it looks like, an almost instantaneous reduction, and then a sustained reduction in that level of offending. So when we look at that example from before, which looks like that, then we see that after the sexual risk order, there's no further offending, this person doesn't go to prison, they're not deported, and as I say, that's quite typical within that data. So this just compares, so the 2 lines going downwards show the significant reductions on the 2 samples where we got sexual risk orders, and the counterfactual population where we talked about it and then didn't sees an increase of just under 70% in terms of sexual harm produced. Again, hammering home the caveat, that is not a control group. nonetheless, I think it starts to give us an insight into what we might want to look at. So, knowing what we do know, should we consider sexual risk orders as a more prominent tactic? Or should we at least be looking to develop the evidence base around sexual risk orders as a means of primary intervention when prosecution isn't viable? I thought this was interesting because this isn't just about future prevention. This is a specific example whereby suspects alleged to have committed a number of rapes over time, different victims. The final officer who deals with the most recent one of those gets a sexual risk order, puts it in place. This particular person targets overwhelmingly females who are vulnerable by virtue of substance abuse, mental health issues, etc. On the sixth occasion, the rape allegation is made, and the victim refuses to provide an interview or an account of what has happened whilst they're in custody because of fear, vulnerability, etc. Sexual risk order breach is charged and the suspect is remanded. And subsequently, we're able to reassure the victim, able to get that victim account. Not only can the rape case proceed where it wouldn't have done otherwise, but the sexual risk order and the suspended sentence that comes from it gives some real teeth to conditions or ways of managing that offender going forward that we know we don't have with police bail conditions. Something that came up in the study, and I think is probably just an interesting comment. When you look at the severity of the conditions applied to individuals, there is no significant association between the application. The more severe conditions don't equal a greater reduction in harm. So as a policy point, and this probably speaks perhaps beyond just sexual risk orders, any approach needs to be bespoke and proportionate rather than just a blanket, oh, these appear to work, let's make them as austere as possible. Do we target them at the most harmful eligible people? So the methodology for this, I looked at the rank ordering essentially of the Met's sexual offenders, so those that have been named on crime reports for sexual offending. The takeaway is that, as we find in most of these studies, harm concentrates really heavily on a small number of individuals, but we do not target sexual risk orders against those individuals. Some data there essentially which supports that. 39,000 offenders, the top 5% concentrates on a really, really small number, 178, and then we looked at only 2 of those receive any sort of sexual risk orders. When you dig into it and you do a case analysis, which I did, they are ultimately, there are a large proportion of those in that highest harm group are eligible or at least are on the face of it eligible for sexual risk orders. So it's not the case that they're not eligible and that's why it doesn't apply. When you look at preventable harm or harm that could conceivably be prevented from that, if we were to target those who commit highest harm, we conceivably would see really, really significant harm prevention value. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that owing to time constraints, but I will, if anyone wants to speak about it, I'm more happy to go in depth on that. Cost benefit, again, I'll move past it quickly, but ultimately when you do a range of cost benefit analysis on what sexual risk orders could deliver, if targeted the most harmful, we see considerable benefit significantly outweighing cost. Policy implications, should we be using these as a tactic of last resort, or should we be considering them much earlier? Should we be using them, should we be waiting until someone has committed 8 or 10 sexual offences before we utilise them? Or should we be considering them at a much earlier stage? At the moment, we don't have any process to identify those who are most worthy of our attention or sexual risk order targeting, albeit there are clearly things in place that we could be utilising them on. We tend to leave these to the individual officers and their discretion. And I think the fact that we don't understand at a force or national level how many of these we have, how we use them, or what the outcomes are, speaks volumes. There are plenty of opportunities, particularly with the rape national operating model at the moment, I think, to embed sexual risk orders front and centre rather than as a last resort. I will finish up. There are plenty of limitations to this research, as there are with most, predominantly the fact that it cannot overwhelmingly speak to causation. It doesn't have a control group. It's not randomised. There are very good reasons for that, given the involvement of the judiciary, and there are ways we could work around that. But I would categorise sexual risk orders as a real opportunity that has been massively underinvested in, and I would suggest it's a promising tactic that is deserving of a little more attention. Thank you.
Okay, something I said. Thanks very much for the three presenters. Some really insightful presentations there on the VORG agenda. And when I spoke initially around those three pillars of activity around VORG, building trust and confidence, relentless pursuit of perpetrators and safer spaces, that ties in really nicely to those three presentations. Alex, I don't think we've got time for it. We've run out of time.
Peter just wants to do a little something.
Absolutely. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Fantastic.
Okay, I'm looking for Brandon. For two of the presentations, firstly, all three were extremely good, but two have been key, have produced really high quality work that I wanted to recognise. The first one, Dan Whitten actually was the top student of his cohort. I can tell you his thesis oversight group had Cressida Dick chairing it and Darry Sherman, and their jaws dropped when they saw that chart, as I think yours did as well. I mean, you don't very often see a chart with the figures around 90% of a drop of serious offending, and we didn't know that before. How many of you in this room knew that before you walked in this room? No. Okay. How many know it now? You all do. Take it back. If you're from Gwent, get on the case. So, Dan, you get the Sir Richard Mayne Award. And I don't know about anybody else, but the marrying of street policing and street intelligence with Operation Vigilant, and also the focus and the timing of that piece and its potential impact is worthy of recognition. So. Right. Now you can go now. And, you know, it really helps. This is another example of why it's so important to have Home Office colleagues in this room who are not just observing it, but are also students, and then are taking this back into the field, into the policy field, because if you're sat in this room thinking, when I go back into the Home Office, I've got that 50% target to meet, you just saw three ways towards that, and that is, it's great, it's uplifting when you're confronted by so much difficulty and a service that's been in so much trouble. These are some of the ways out of that avenue that the service got itself into, and I do feel that's a kind of uplifting bit of this day so far. So.